What's up, Rovers? It's the second half of patch 1.2, and you know what that means. If you've been doing your Moonlit Fair diligently, you'll be able to claim your free Xiangli Yao by just logging in and checking the event page. You only need 5,000-6,000 from the event, which can easily be done in a single day. Is our new limited Gauntlet Electro Hyper Carry, ready to complete our Electro roster. If you've ever played Calcharo, you'll feel right at home with Xiangli Yao. His kit works very similarly, making it easy to get a hold of his ult-dependent playstyle. As always, all explanations and testing is backed by math, and my spreadsheets will be listed in description and pinned for cross-referencing. Let's do a once-over on how this guide will go. As always, I will give a TLDR of his role and mechanics and then a deeper dive. Then we look at Forte leveling priorities, echo sets, main stats and substats, then weapon choices and comparisons. Follow up with the good stuff, endgame stat goals, sequences, and what they mean for the team. Then, team options and rotations, including cancels and back swaps, unit comparisons, and finally, an ending summary. Let's get started. Xiangli Yao is the genius of the Academy and had once upon a time worked closely with Jinzhou Academia before an incident that made him turn his back on that path. A man with hidden regrets, he nevertheless always looks forward and carries his analytical research attitude into combat. Calm and collected, his kit features many futuristic projections, tesseracts, sci-fi energy blades from his multi-tool gauntlet, and more. He basically wields theorems and physics as weapons in battle to gap close or attack from a distance. Compared to Calcharo, he has similar or ever so slightly higher damage per second, but has longer and higher rotation damage, bigger and more generous hitbox shapes, much more concerto and liberation energy generation, a practically infinitely long liberation nuke window to pick your damage windows, built-in hyper armor and liberation, and the potential for backswapping. It is also much easier to build his liberation special Forte bar with dodge counters and skill cast counting for stacks as well. On the other hand, it is difficult to fit his entire DPS nuke within Yinlin's massive outro buff. He can feel a bit clunky, and, well, he isn't Sephiroth. And yes, this means once again there will be a big discussion about Void Thunder versus Lingering Tunes later. Okay, but how do you actually use this kit? Just like Calcharo, his non-liberations Forte bar isn't as important and is normally used as supplemental damage or gap closer tool when available. I would still recommend building it up because the full Forte bar skill does big damage, which I'll explain how with minimal interruptions to his nuke rotation later. Most of Xiangli Yao's rotation revolves around his actual liberation phase. He does a massive AoE nuke, then grants himself 3 hypercubes that are consumed one by one from his big liberation skill, Law of Rains. How do you cast Law of Rains in Liberation? His new Forte Liberation bar, reminiscent of Calcharo, has 5 segments and can be built via enhanced Liberation basic attacks, Liberation resonance skill casts, Liberation dodge counters, and a special aerial move. When you reach 5 stacks, casting Liberation Resonance skill will instead use Law of Rains, doing absolutely massive AoE damage at range. In other words, spam moves to build his 5 stacks, cast his Hypercube nuke, and repeat 2 more times to end his liberation. However, his story doesn't end here. He has the highest outro damage in the entire game, boosted even further if you pick Lingering Tunes or his sequences. There are also several opportunities for animation and backswap cancels, which will be discussed later. Xiangli Yao is the main carry in his teams, and thus we look towards his Forte Circuit and Liberation as your first priorities. They're actually equal in value, with the Forte Circuit edging slightly ahead. However, in practice, you will most likely have to dodge or slightly delay rotations to adapt in combat, taking advantage of his otherwise unused massive Liberation dodge counter values and extra enhanced basic attacks, therefore level both of them equally. He has 50 to 60% liberation percent damage, but most of this actually comes from his Forte Circuit. While he has an extremely generous 24 seconds liberation duration to get all 3 hypercubes off, which usually takes about only 12 to 13 seconds, I would still recommend picking up his inherent skills next for hyper armor while in liberation, and a free electro percent buff every time he casts any kind of skill. The value of remaining Forte trees fall off drastically from there. If you're interested in casting his normal Forte skill, Decipher, the big DPS gap closer move, then his resonance skill Deduction will be casted twice per rotation and thus is more important than his normal attack tree and intro skill. Otherwise, his normal resonance skill and intro tree skills all hold little value. In other words, there's no reason to level those 3 above level 6. Let's take a closer look at how Xiangli Yao's Forte Circuit works. It has 2 versions, one for out of liberation and one for in liberation. Normally his forte is one long bar that holds up to 100 capacity. This ordinary capacity can be built by basic attack non-liberation hits and the ordinary skill deduction. At 100 cap, your skill is replaced by Decipher, which is essentially a grapple hook that does massive aerial damage at its destination, with a smaller cleave hitbox. Building 100 capacity is awkward because his rotation does not usually do much non-liberation movesets. However, as a minimum, you should be casting the ordinary skill deduction right before and right after his liberation phase because it gives a big amount of forte and deals decent damage. More on this when we get to rotations. While in Liberation, Xiangli Yao enters the Intuition state, which lasts until either all 3 hypercubes that are granted to him are consumed via Law of Rain casts or 24 seconds pass. He also gains a new Forte bar segmented into 5 performance capacity. His skill is replaced by Divergence, has a new basic moveset, and can now cast Law of Rains when at 5 Forte stacks, consuming them. These stacks are built from his special Liberation moveset, the new skill and new basic attacks, as well as Revamp, a special aerial plunge move, and his new dodge counter. And that's pretty much it. Now, there is a special move called Revamp, as I mentioned, that can be used after casting your 100 Forte bar Decipher skill, or Liberation base skill, Divergence, while in the air by pressing basic attack. This move actually sucks, and its only use should be building performance capacity while in Liberation. Avoid using it otherwise. It's the one move you really want to animation cancel and is the lowest DPS move on his entire kit. Yao's Liberation is his main damage loop, and it allows him to enter the Intuition state, completely replacing his entire kit and unlocking his Forte Circuit's 5-segment version of his bar. Casting this currently deals the highest nuke AoE in the game initially, besides Jinzhi's Incandescence boosted Dragon Puke, before changing to Intuition state, complete with full time stop. His animations fully reset before time stop ends, unlike other characters like Zhezhi, so allowing you to attack immediately afterwards. His new skill cast and basic chain mainly serve to build performance capacity Forte stacks, so that you can cast Law of Rain skill when you reach 5. The ordinary Liberation skill move Divergence is an amazing gap closer tool with high DPS and the fastest way to build performance capacity, and should always be used when possible, and is also backswap friendly. Now, there's very little to say about Yao's ordinary resonance skill, Deduction. All of the alternate skill casts belong to his Forte Circuit and Liberation trees instead. However, Deduction is required to build Forte fast enough to cast Decipher, the 100 Forte bar gap closer move with massive DPS. Therefore, because it has a 5 seconds cooldown, Deduction should be casted before going to Liberation, and afterwards before swapping off, because each cast produces 40 normal capacity of the 100 required for Decipher. Yao's normal attack tree is even more useless than his resonance skill tree and is almost entirely unused in proper rotations. On Void Thunder sets, you basically basic once plus heavy to activate the part of the 5-piece Electro bonus effect. On Lingering Tunes, you still basic 1 plus heavy to build a 20 missing capacity to cast Decipher, but this is at the end of the rotation. Otherwise, there are even rotations where people completely skip using anything from this tree. I would not recommend leveling this past 6. Yao's intro skill Principle is a very average damage skill. It doesn't activate anything on his kit, so it isn't important. It isn't required for Liberation Energy or Concerto Generation because he easily overcaps on both each rotation. Once again, I would not recommend leveling his intro past 6. Now, you thought Yao's damage ends when his Liberation ends? Nah, his outro is a beast. This is currently the strongest outro in the game, of which Mech Abomination buffs even further by granting a plus 60% damage as outro damage percent. It basically deals 3 hits once every 2 seconds triggered by basic attacks of your incoming Resonator, but without the coordinated damage classification. His sequences buff this thing into a monstrosity to the point that it can match his Liberation first hit nuke. I would strongly recommend picking up Yao's inherent skills when you can, because they are the only source of buffs on his entire kit. In other words, he also strongly benefits from teammate buffs since he doesn't dilute them much himself. Knowing grants him 5% Electro per skill cast for 8 seconds, stacking up to 4 times for 20%. Yao will always cast another skill within 8 seconds when he's on field and usually has it fully stacked about 60% into his total DPS output. The entire rest of his damage is applied before any stacks expire. His other inherent skill grants him Hyper Armor while his Liberation is active, something Calcharo desperately wanted in his base kit. Granted, with a 24 seconds Liberation duration, it's non-mandatory, but it helps to maintain clean, faster rotations. For minor notes, this time Yao veers from his contemporary limited 5-star friends and grants 16% crit damage instead of 8% crit rate. He also grants himself 12% attack, making it easier to build him. There is a TLDR version and a long version of his Echo discussion. On a surface level, Xiangli Yao can be played as both a traditional non-swap hypercarry, where you don't interrupt his rotation, or quick swap, because he has many opportunities to fit other resonator moves in. This is mainly because his liberation lasts 24 seconds or until you use all 3 hypercubes, and that each hypercube move, as well as gap closer moves and liberation, all take well over 1 second to cast. Recall that backswapping works on any move that takes longer than 1 second with no time lost. His 2 Echo sets choices are thus Lingering Tunes and Void Thunder. For practical purposes, almost every variation of these sets is plus or minus 5% damage of each other. Or in other words, inconsequential for paper DPS, use the one that you have better sets and substats for. What is more important is how their buffs work. Void Thunder buffs stick even on swap out, whereas the 5-piece effect of Lingering Tunes requires you to stay on field. Therefore, if you play quick swap Xiangli Yao, use Void Thunder. If you play traditional non-swap hypercarry, use Lingering Tunes. But if you want to know why, both of these sets go a lot deeper. The best companion for Xiangli Yao is Yinlin, who buffs both Electro and Liberation damage on Outro, which is perfect for a new Gauntlet's DPS that focuses on Electro and Liberation damage. However, Yinlin's outro only lasts 14 seconds. Calcharo's full rotation only lasted 12 seconds, so this wasn't an issue. Xiangli Yao's rotation, on the other hand, lasts 15.5 to 17.5 depending on echo set and rotation choices. Shorter rotations exist, but are a minor personal DPS loss and a noticeable overall team DPS loss. This means that Yinlin's outro is very likely to expire before Yao's final Law of Rain's cast, resulting in him instantly losing 5% total DPS of his rotation just from that. The only way to fit his third Law of Rain's cast within Yinlin's outro is with Lingering Tunes. Additionally, because his initial liberation hit, Cogitation Model, is the strongest nuke in the game, you want to outro Yinlin onto him before he casts it, which means you cannot swap up of Yao if you want both his initial big hit and also his third Law of Rains to be buffed by her. Mech Abomination also grants his outro plus 60% outro damage to the already strongest outro in the game. Furthermore, Lingering Tunes' 5-piece effect resets every single time you swap off him, cementing it as the only non-swap Yao choice. But what about Void Thunder? To activate the 5-piece 30% Electro effect, you need to separately use both the Skil and a Heavy cast for 2 stacks of 15%. You cannot double cast Skil or double cast Heavy, or use different versions of a Skil out of Liberation and in Liberation. It needs to specifically be a Skil cast and a Heavy cast. You would definitely want this active before casting his big initial Liberation nuke, meaning you are now forced to spend extra time heavy attacking before Liberation. Not only does this waste more time, but the Tempest Mephis cast itself guarantees it's impossible to land your third Law of Rain cast in Liberation before Yinlin's outro expires. Therefore, Void Thunder is unsuitable for non-swap Yao, but is a really good choice for quick swap Yao because he retains the 5-piece effect even when swapping, unlike the Lingering Tune set that resets every time. For his energy requirements, they're surprisingly low. If you run the full proper DPS rotation, 100 to 110 is actually enough. He overcaps Concerto and Liberation energy very easily. If you run the short version rotation, which ignores his out of Liberation moveset completely, he still only needs about 120. This means whatever random ER rolls you get for him are most likely enough already. Focus all of your rolls into crits and attack percent. Attack flat is superior to liberation percent on Xiangli Yao because the breakpoint is 70 to 75% damage profile, and only 50 to 60% of Yao's damage comes from liberation damage. If you ask me, Lingering Tunes is much easier to use on him overall for basically equal damage per rotation and allows you to even completely ignore his basic and heavy attacks if you don't care about his out of Liberation Forte bar, whereas Void Thunder still needs you to heavy attack to get the full 5-piece effects. Lingering Tunes even has higher actual DPS if you're going 4-3-3-1-1 Electro, and still equal DPS if you go Electro Attack. If you go non-swap Yao, Lingering Tunes becomes strictly superior when considering team buffs sticking to him for his entire DPS window. You don't need to worry about sequences as they do not alter your desired stat splits and substats in a meaningful way that requires refarming. Now, gauntlets are in kind of a bad spot. About half of them are defense-oriented or buff and healing-oriented for support setups. Xiangli Yao was a full-on hypercarry. As a result, there are not that many good gauntlets for him, and the ones that are useful stand out a ton. Note that his signature, Verity's handle, and a few other weapons grant resonance percent as a passive effect, and it's diluted by Void Thunder's electro percent buffs, whereas attack percent weapons are diluted by the lingering tunes set instead. Because his best weapon choices all give resonance percent in some way, his best weapons result in the biggest damage increase when used on lingering tunes. We can see that R1 Verity's handle is nearly a 22% damage increase over R1 Abyss Surges, the standard 5-star gauntlet on lingering tunes. If you haven't picked up Abyss Surges yet, I would actually recommend grabbing Yao's signature even for general use. It is the first 5-star gauntlet with crit Mainstats. Furthermore, it grants 12% attribute percent, which is essentially an all-element bonus that works on everything, and one of the reasons why Age of Harvest, whatever it's called, and String Master work so well. Most, but not all DPS units also deal relevant liberation damage, making the gauntlet's liberation percent more likely to be useful than a highly specialized skill percent or basic percent, like Judger's Rectifier. Of course, attack percent is the bonus passive that would be best, like String Master, but also keep in mind that type of bonus would make it incompatible for a defense scaling 5-star DPS nuke in the future. And yes, this is also the best DPS gauntlet for Jianxin and Yuanwu if you want them to DPS. Abyss Surge is a strong gauntlet just by raw attack percent stats and extremely high flat attack with universally useful energy recharge. So if you already have it, it is up to you on whether or not to grab his signature weapon. Outside of that, your next free-to-play option is Hollow Mirage, which is a very far step down from Verity's handle, parsing at just 85 to 87% regardless of Echo Set, in part because of its much weaker passive effects. Mirage's passive also depends on you playing hit lists to maintain its buffs, and the chart numbers already assumed constant max buff. In other words, his R1 signature deals 1.4 times higher damage than an R5 Hollow Mirage at constant no-hit max buff. On the paid side, the Battle Pass Stonard weapon is actually extremely good for Xiangli Yao, and nearly matches Abyss Surges at R5 on lingering tunes. This is because of its strong crit main stats and specifically buffing liberation damage for the entire duration of his liberation window, which is easily activated by precasting Skil before his cogitation model nuke. It also syntonizes extremely well, granting 54% liberation damage at R5. It's basically identical to his signature, just missing the much higher attack stat and 12% attribute buff. Outside of these options, all other ones kind of suck. Being defense, HP, or otherwise weird passives, the usable 3-star weapons are basically the reskinned 4-stars, with Gauntlets of the Night being a lower attack percent, and shorter attack percent duration buff version of Hollow Mirage, and Originite being the crit damage version of Stornut's crit rate with much lower attack and a completely useless passive. Now, if you manage to achieve all that we've discussed so far, then his endgame substats should look a little bit like this. Do keep in mind these are scaled to level 90 with maxed out Fortes, so can take some time to reach this. We're at the final part of Yao's kit, his sequences. They are actually pretty busted, and if you want deeper detail, please check my spreadsheets, as I have a tab specifically for calculating the effects of each sequence and highlighted cells and how it impacts his kit. All math was done assuming R1 Verity's handle. Note that all values are quoted in vacuum and will be somewhat diluted in full team comp rotations. Expect down to roughly 4/5 of the listed scaling when accounting for buffs from the rest of your team. His S1 spawns 6 extra cubes, each dealing 8% of his Law of Rain's big skill on cast with max Liberation Forte bar as liberation damage. The TLDR is it effectively just acts like a 1.48 times total damage multiplier on that move. This is a decent 13% increase overall on his damage. His S2 grants in a near permanent 30% crit damage buff, but it's a bit weak compared to other units S2, like Xiangli granting plus 25% permanent crit rate, which would be effectively 50% crit damage. Anyways, this triggers on any kind of skill cast, which is usually what you do right after casting Opening Echo. It's an 8% damage increase over S1. S2 Yao is 1.23 times as strong as S0. His S3 buffs his next 5 of any skill cast by a final 63% damage increase when he casts his Liberation. Coincidentally, his optimal rotation casts exactly 5 skills inside of his Liberation state anyways, so this perfectly matches that. This results in a rather large 29% damage increase over his S2. S3 Yao is 1.58 times as strong as S0. His 4 is worded weirdly, but it grants 25% liberation damage bonus to his team for 30 seconds after he casts his own liberation. It is not a final damage multiplier to liberations percent, and it's specifically liberation percent, not quotes damage originating from casting liberation, for example, Judger's liberation, which is actually basic percent, and would thus not benefit from this. It's similar to how most limited unit S4s grant team-wide attack, or in Jian's case grants team-wide heavy damage, etc. S4 is only a 6.6% damage increase over S3 for Yao, but consider that it is also a team-wide buff, and is what allows him to dual DPS well with Calcharo or other liberation-dependent resonators. S4 Yao is 1.69 times as strong as S0. Now S5 is absolutely busted, more than tripling his outro damage, which is already the strongest in the game and of course costs 0 field time to deal damage. This grants 3.22 times scaling to Chain Rule, boosting it up to 765.17% motion value per hit, or as strong as some Resonators' Liberation hits. It also doubles his Cogitation model hit, you know, the strongest single hit nuke in the entire game besides Jinzhi's Dragon Puke with max incandescent stacks, to 2,932%. S5 is a 29% damage increase over S4 and is 2.17 times as strong as S0. S6 is a very simple boost to Law of Rains, multiplying its motion value by 1.76 times to 1,123% per cast, or essentially stronger than most Resonators' Liberation casts. S6 is 28% stronger than S5 and 2.78 times stronger than S0. Yes, at S6, his Cogitation becomes twice as strong, and every Law of Rains cast, every outro hit, becomes a tactical nuke as well. It's finally time to talk about Yao's rotations. There are two main options depending on if you use Void Thunder or Lingering Tune set. Each option also has shorter rotation versions, which focuses only on the Liberation segment, but note that it doesn't have any better DPS and sometimes might even be a slight DPS loss and is obviously less DPS per rotation. Short rotations are only recommended for use when trying to squeeze within 3-star time windows in time attack. Animation and swap cancels are identical for each and are incredibly easy to use. They mainly focus on Yao's 5 big moves he uses in every rotation available that each take well over 1 second to cast. Moves that can be backswapped with 0 or almost 0 time loss are noted with a caret notation. Animation cancel moves are instead noted with an asterisk. As a reminder, Yao's rotations focus on getting into his liberation ASAP to get the big nuke AoE hit, then building enough performance capacity to cast Law of Rain skill 3 times for even more AoE DPS. His non-liberation Forte bar is not as important but can be built rather easily and contributes relevant but not superb damage. Concerto and Liberation energy are never an issue since he easily overcaps no matter what rotation variation he uses. First off, Void Thunder rotations. While his intro is not important, you typically intro with a unit that has a useful outro effect for him, such as Yinlin, so it is possible that you'll be introing anyways. After that, you will always echo to proc your Void Thunder buff with Tempest, then basic plus hold to instantly heavy. As soon as the heavy hit frame connects, cancel with your skill cast deduction. This heavy attack is used to activate half of Void Thunder's 5-piece effect, as there is no easier way. As soon as the skill hit frames, cast your Liberation Cogitation model. This cuts down about half to full second across the heavy and skill. The fastest way to stack 5 Fortes in Liberation is to use your new skill plus basic ground slam in air. This will cast Divergence plus Revamp. It takes 7 seconds for Divergence to come off cooldown, so you Divergence plus Revamp plus Law of Rains to nuke, and then you now have to spam basic attacks for your second Law of Rains while waiting for Divergences to come off cooldown. Then on the third cycle, you cast Divergence plus Revamp again. Divergence and Law of Rains are both very slow casts that take well over 1 second, and can be backswapped to another character of choice to reset effects like Verina buffs or apply damage and build off unit concerto like Yinlin. Therefore, casting the Liberation would go like this: Divergence, optional backswap, Revamp to Law of Rains, optional backswap, basic times 3, Law of Rains, optional backswap, Divergence, optional backswap, Revamp to Law of Rains, optional backswap. Cast your normal skill deduction and then decipher and swap off to avoid the problems of it putting you in the air. Chain Rule outro will activate and proc off basic attacks of your next Resonator for big damage. Now if you want to do the short rotation, it's the exact same thing, but you swap off immediately on the third Law of Rains cast. It will still finish in dual hits, but you skip the animation time and final deduction plus decipher. This shaves the Void Thunder rotation down from 17.5 to just above 15.5 seconds, but still retains equal damage per second. Note that because Xiangli Yao is the highest DPS unit on the team, shortening his rotation like this will drag overall team DPS down, and the shorter rotation is used only for cycling his next burst window 2 seconds sooner if needed to meet time attack situations. Lingering Tune's rotation is very similar as well, except we moved the basic plus heavy to the end of rotation because it is no longer needed to activate a 5-piece set effect, like on Void Thunder. This moves our third Law of Rain cast up early enough to land before 14 seconds pass, meaning it will fully benefit from Yinlin's outro, or any other buff unit that has a 14 seconds outro effect, like Jianxin. We still open with Intro plus Mech Abomination, which has a much faster animation. You cast Skill Deduction and cancel it on hit frame with Cogitation Model. We go Divergence into Revamp, then our first Law of Rains. Then Basic 3 times, then Law of Rains again. Then Divergence plus Revamp into Law of Rains a 3rd time to finish your Liberation phase. Spam 2 basics after 3rd Rains. It will for some reason use the Liberation moveset. Then double skill to reach 100 capacity and cast Decipher. This procs our outro chain rule again, which is actually buffed by Mech Abomination for plus 60% outro damage. As mentioned in the Void Thunder rotation, every Divergence and Law of Rains cast can be backswapped to recast buffs or stack damage in Calcharo on off characters, like Verina and Yinlin. Note that doing so will reset Lingering Tune's 5-piece plus 20% attack effect though. If you want the short rotation, it's once again the exact same, and swapping off immediately after the 3rd Law of Rains cast. It will still finish in dual hits, and this lets you skip the animation time, the basic plus heavy, second deduction, and also decipher. You can even skip the initial deduction cast, as it shaves the Lingering Tune's rotation down from 16 seconds to just 12. And has actually slightly higher DPS. Note that again, this will drag team DPS down because Xiangli Yao is the highest DPS unit on the team, and shortening rotations is only really recommended for cycling your next burst window 2 seconds sooner if needed to meet time attack situations. Alright, finally, let's talk about Yao's team building options. Unless otherwise specified, the 3rd team member is assumed to be Verina. She can be substituted with Baizhi, but will result in slow rotations and less damage. In the future, Shorekeeper will probably fit as well. Now, due to his big cleave hitboxes, AoE size on big moves, and gap closer utility as well as putting himself in the air, he actually has decent survivability combined with innate hyper armor from his inherent skill, Focus. He's a main DPS carry with very comfortable to use rotations fitting both quick swap or dedicated hyper carry. Quick swaps and back swaps fit due to his Liberation's 24 seconds duration and long cast animations on Divergence and Law of Rains. I've listed the tiering of most commonly used Yao teams on screen to sum things up quickly for those curious. Details on specific team comps will be explained in the respective teammates section. Yinlin is the obvious choice, being the perfectly matching partner for Electro DPS. She grants massive Electro and Liberation deepen on her outro, but keep in mind it only lasts 14 seconds. Because Yao's rotation is slow, with the 3rd Law of Rains coming out over 13 seconds later even on Lingering Tunes, but that is hardest hitting nuke Cogitation Model at 1333% at skill 10, and is casted at the very top as rotation 2 to 4 seconds in, it is actually not recommended to play Yao's quick swap with Yinlin. This is not because it's bad, but because there is very little DPS to gain by doing so. You either lose her outro on his 3rd Law of Rains when you could otherwise fit it consistently, or lose her outro on his initial nuke, which is the current highest motion value in the entire game besides Jinxi's Incandescent's boosted Dragon Puke. This is in contrast to Calcharo, who only carries a 596% motion value, or less than half on his initial Liberation hit. Calcharo Quickswap also benefits from avoiding hits that would interrupt his DPS, whereas Yao already has hyper armor built in for anti-interruption. You're free to do what you wish, but please remember that Quickswap Yao is mainly flair and showmanship, and not practical for DPS gain. Yinlin would only need 110 to 115 ER when paired with Yao, and this is because of his longer than usual DPS rotation, and abnormally high Liberation energy generation. It allows you to play Yinlin with just 1 to 2 ER rolls instead of the usual 2 to 3. Her expected rotation is the usual intro plus echo if Mephis, or save it till end if Heron. You cast Liberation, then double skill and triple heavy to max out your Forte bar, heavy to proc her coordinated damage, and outro onto Yao. But perhaps somewhat surprisingly, Calcharo actually works with Xiangli Yao. Now, this is not budget friendly, as now you have to build 2 main DPS and manage their rotations well. Calcharo's rotations are quite long as a second DPS option, so how would this team work? Your third unit, be it Yinlin or Verina, would be weaved inside of Calcharo's rotation to cut down on team rotations, meaning Yao will be played as non-swap, whereas Calcharo plus third unit are quick swap. This means you should be using Lingering Tunes for Yao. This teammate suggestion works best for those that are not ready to bench Calcharo just yet and wondering if it's possible to play Yao and Calcharo together. I will not be going into Calcharo quick swap rotations because honestly I'm bad at them, but this is mainly here to suggest it does work. More importantly, this team actually rises in value if you grab Yao and Calcharo sequences, as Yao's S4 buffs team liberation damage for 30 seconds when casting his ult, allowing you to swap Yao's rotation directly into Calcharo afterwards. Calcharo's S4 buffs team electro damage for 30 seconds when casting his outro, allowing you to further buff Yao in the second team rotation onwards. Calcharo only needs 115 to 120 ER on this team comp because, once again, Yao's long rotations and high liberation energy generation lowers the entire team's ER requirement so that he only needs 2 rolls. Void Thunder will favor Calcharo better for quick swap, but Lingering Tunes also works. Instead of explaining Calcharo's rotation, I'll explain this full team's rotation. You start with Yinlin or Verina, then you outro into Yao and do his full normal rotation without swaps. Then outro into Calcharo. You will quick swap Calcharo back and forth with Yinlin or Verina like the current Cal-Yin playstyle. If it's Yinlin, make sure to outro Calcharo onto Yinlin and then Yinlin onto Yao specifically, so that Yinlin's outro Electro plus Liberation buff sticks to him and restarts the team rotation. I'm leaving this specific timestamp to address the Calcharo plus Yinlin team variant versus Calcharo plus Verina for Xiangli Yao. Now, I would not advise picking up the Calcharo plus Yinlin variant if you are new to Calcharo quick swap. It is very hard to play properly, relies entirely on quick swaps for Calcharo's survivability, and is just all around very unforgiving. With sequences, it rivals and can surpass the Calcharo plus Yinlin or Yinlin plus Verina variant, but again, I want to stress this is not recommended for your average player, but rather to state that yes, it is possible to play Calcharo and Yao together. Verina is the next obvious viable choice. I don't think I need to explain much about Verina at this point. Swapping into her without intro puts her into basic 3 automatically, allowing you to easily reach basic 5 to build one Forte stack quickly. This lets her work well for quick swap as well as standard intro-outro swap. She brings heals, minuscule coordinated damage, but insanely fast Calcharo gen and strong damage and element final multiplier buffs, as well as easily proccing the healer 5-piece set, build her for at least 175 ER and Bell. Higher is better, so you don't have to worry about it for faster other teams you might put her on. Jianxin is the budget version of Yinlin for Yao comps, offering a more defensive choice, as well as grouping to allow his AoE nukes to mob groups easier. Now, I still don't own her, so unfortunately I cannot comment much on her rotations or gearing. I apologize. But the main reason to bring her is the 38% liberation final multiplier on an outro to next Resonator. Massive suck for mobbing, easy parries, and comfortable tanking hits if needed. Yes, there's still that Jiaklone Bell plus Forte circuit strat for 100% damage reduction on her. No, I don't know if it was ever patched because I don't have her, so I can't test it. She is the ultimate comfort choice for Yao comps when you know you already have high enough damage. Now, Havoc Rover specifically fits quite well into Yao's rotation on her Hyper Burst short rotation. This is because the sheer amount of slow animations Yao has that can be backswap allows you to fit the full short rotation. He has 5 distinct moves per rotation that take over 1 second each and can be backswapped easily. These are primarily his Law of Range and Divergence casts. It allows you to balance Yao's long field time with a short field time sub DPS that deals massive damage. It works best in Yao quickswap comps because it will eliminate the effects of Jianxin or Yinlin's outro effects. It also means that you would outro your character onto Havoc Rover for Forte generation, plus skill casts before manually swapping to Yao. This is because Yao does not need nor benefit from his intro in any way whatsoever. However, Havoc Rover actually desires intro to build her Forte bar easier. This team comp will most likely shine best with Baijer or Verina, or in the future, Shorekeeper is the third slot. Full disclosure, the Hyperburst Havoc Rover short rotation comes from Pridwin, and sourced from Zhezhi's work. The reason why this works is because Yao produces so much liberation energy that Rover doesn't need much field time. At some point during Yao's rotation, backswap to Rover to cast Skil again. Then when Havoc Rover intros, use Skil again, heavy attack to go into Dark Angel state, and if you have Havoc Rover's S2, immediately Skil Life Taker, then cast their massive ultimate nuke, then Dreamless Swap Cancel, outro. There's no specific amount of moves you need Rover to take during each backswap, it's just what you're comfortable with. It's just that you follow this order of moves and fit all moves within Yao's 5 backswap windows. It allows you to pick and choose when and where to use each of Havoc Rover's arsenal for maximal effect. This specific Rover setup should be built with 130 ER, since they will barely generate any liberation energy themselves. Note that there is zero synergy between Havoc Rover and Yao beyond the absolutely massive damage Rover's Hyperburst short rotation can deal. Danjin is the budget version of Havoc Rover's Hyperburst quickswap rotation. Honestly, if you had to pick between the two for this purpose, Havoc Rover does it much better. But because Danjin has no actual specific rotation, you can easily squeeze her in for damage here and there. Note that she does not work well for quickswap backswap, because all of her combo chains require multiple basic hits followed by multiple skill hits. This would essentially be a dual carry setup with occasional quick swaps. Because Danjin is not reliant on her burst, and Yao also generates a ton of liberation energy, she can run just fine with 100. Both Dreamless and Mech Abomination work on her here. Now, for Zhezhi, this one doesn't need much explaining. Zhezhi works because she brings good coordinated damage to the table like Yinlin. However, she does nothing else and is 2 seconds longer in field time than your typical Yinlin rotation. Her outro does not buff Yao in any meaningful way, however this means she can be played as both quickswap and non-swap with Yao. You can leave her on Moonlit Realm and Permanent Harem regardless, as Glacial Set is not a good choice for her in this kind of team. She will need about 110 to 115 ER to Liberation consistently on this team, which Moonlit already gives. You intro with her, then basic 3 times to max out Forte bar. Alternatively, you can double intro on her since Yao doesn't care about his own intro. At full Forte bar, use Skill plus basic to produce 3 imprints, then spam Skill 3 times and swap off. Prioritize casting her Liberation whenever possible, preferably at the top of her rotation. The quick swap is just one extra step. It's actually just the double intro rotation. Because Yao does not benefit from his intro whatsoever, Verina intros into Zhezhi, and it immediately swaps to Yao's entire rotation. When you outro Yao, Zhezhi's second intro will fill the rest of her Forte bar, eliminating the need to use basic attacks on her at all. Now, Yangyang is the final teammate of note who functions mainly to just group enemies for better mob nuking with Yao. She's basically guaranteed to already have her Liberation fully charged when brought in because of Yao's high Liberation energy generation rate, making her extremely easy to use, essentially the budget version of Jianxin. Just give her Overture and it's easily more than enough ER, plus Moonlit Heron set to outro her directly onto Yao. If no one on the team is using Healing Set, you can even give her Originite Weapon plus Bell, Heal Set. She does not need any additional ER. When introing onto her, it puts her in the air, and if your Forte bar is full, slamming down cast Feather Release, producing a ton of Concerto. Then cast Skill plus Heavy plus Basic to generate 2 Forte stacks for next rotation, and ults to group enemies, then Heron or Bell and outro onto Yao. Thank you so much for watching through this entire video. I'm super glad we managed to get it out on time, and it's been a journey. Hopefully this information has been useful to help you decide on whether to build Xiangli Yao or pick up his weapon. As a reminder, all spreadsheets documenting my testing can be found in the description and pinned comment. Do feel free to make a copy if you want to change values and test stuff. Cheers! If this is your first time watching, feel free to leave a like or better yet subscribe. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Stick around if you want to see interesting videos. Don't want to miss out on any of that, do you? That'll be it for this video. Thank you all for watching and see you all next time.